The rain was pouring down on a quiet street when an 8-year-old girl looked out the window and saw something that made her heart stop. A woman sat alone at the bus stop across the road, soaked by the rain, clutching a small torn bag like it was the only thing she had left in the world. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from having nowhere to go. Inside the warm house, the little girl turned to her father with worried eyes and asked a question that would change 3 lives forever. "Daddy, can she stay with us?" He looked outside again at the homeless woman sitting in the cold, and in that moment he had to make a choice: ignore her like everyone else had, or open his door to a stranger. But what happened after that simple question would lead to a story of kindness, second chances, and a family that formed in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, if you believe a small act of kindness can change someone's life, like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories. The rain had started just before sunset, turning the quiet suburban street into a blur of silver reflections and trembling shadows. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long pools of pale light across wet pavement. Most people had already hurried inside their warm homes, doors shut against the cold wind that pushed through the trees like a restless whisper. But at the far end of the street, beneath a crooked bus stop sign, someone remained outside in the storm. A woman sat there, wrapped in a thin, worn coat that looked far too fragile to protect her from the night. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, and beside her rested a small, tattered bag, the only thing she seemed to own. From the window of a nearby house, a little girl noticed her. If you believe the world still needs kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who believes in compassion, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us how powerful a single act of kindness can be. Inside the warm house lived a man named Daniel and his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Their home was simple but comfortable, filled with soft lamps, quiet music, and the smell of soup simmering in the kitchen. It was the kind of home that felt safe the moment someone stepped inside. But safety had not always been part of Daniel's life. Just 2 years earlier, grief had hollowed his world when Lily's mother passed away after a sudden illness. Since then, father and daughter had learned how to build a new rhythm together, one built on quiet strength, bedtime stories, and the small routines that kept their hearts moving forward. That evening, Lily stood by the window, her small hands pressed gently against the cool glass. She watched the woman outside with a seriousness that seemed older than her years. Children often notice things adults overlook, and something about the lonely figure in the rain stirred something deep inside her young heart. Daniel was stirring the soup when Lily walked slowly into the kitchen. Her eyes carried a quiet urgency. He followed her back to the window, and that was the moment he saw the woman. She sat hunched beneath the bus stop shelter, though the shelter barely shielded her from the wind. The rain drifted sideways in gusts, soaking her coat and darkening the pavement around her. She looked tired in a way that went far beyond physical exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that comes from carrying too many silent battles for too long. Daniel frowned slightly. It wasn't unusual for someone to pass through the neighborhood, but something about her stillness caught his attention. She didn't seem like someone waiting for a bus. She seemed like someone with nowhere else to go. Lily looked up at her father with wide eyes filled with compassion. "Daddy," she asked softly, "can she stay with us?" Children have a way of asking questions that cut straight through the complicated defenses adults build over time. Daniel felt that question land heavily in his chest. For a moment, he didn't answer. He had spent the past 2 years trying to protect Lily, trying to keep their life stable and predictable. Letting a stranger into their home wasn't a small decision. The world wasn't always safe, and responsibility had taught him to be cautious. But Lily kept looking at him. Outside, the woman shivered slightly as another gust of wind swept across the street. Daniel watched her carefully. Something about her posture, the way she held herself, small, almost apologetic, made it clear she wasn't dangerous. She looked more like someone who had been invisible for far too long. The rain grew heavier. Finally, Daniel reached for his coat. He walked outside alone first. The cold air hit him immediately, sharp and biting. By the time he reached the bus stop, his shoes were already damp from the wet pavement. The woman noticed him approaching and looked up slowly. Her eyes were cautious, but not hostile. Up close, Daniel could see the faint lines of exhaustion on her face. She looked like someone who once lived a very different life, but had been worn down by something the world rarely understood. He spoke gently. He told her his daughter had noticed her sitting in the rain. He told her there was warm soup inside and a dry place to sit for a while if she wanted. The woman hesitated. Pride and survival often live side by side in people who have lost everything. Accepting help can feel harder than enduring hardship. But the rain kept falling. After a long moment, she nodded. When they stepped inside the house, Lily was waiting near the doorway with a blanket in her arms. Her face lit up with quiet relief when she saw the woman enter. The warmth of the house wrapped around them immediately. Steam curled softly from the pot on the stove, and the gentle glow of lamplight made the space feel safe. The woman looked overwhelmed. She sat carefully at the kitchen table as Daniel placed a bowl of soup in front of her. Lily set the blanket around her shoulders with the seriousness of someone performing an important duty. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic. Daniel didn't ask questions right away. Some stories take time to unfold. But as the evening passed, the woman slowly began to speak. Her name was Maria, and the story of how she ended up at that bus stop was far more heartbreaking than Daniel could have imagined.
Maria's voice carried the quiet heaviness of someone who had repeated the same painful memories many times, yet each retelling still felt fresh with emotion. She explained that she hadn't always lived on the streets. There had once been a small apartment, a job at a local grocery store, and a life that felt ordinary in the best possible way. Ordinary meant stability. Ordinary meant knowing where you would sleep at night and believing tomorrow would look a lot like today. But life has a way of changing without warning. First, the store where she worked closed suddenly after the company went bankrupt. It happened fast. One week the shelves were full, the next week the doors were locked and a notice hung in the window. Maria had tried to stay hopeful at first. She applied for jobs everywhere she could think of, restaurants, warehouses, small shops. Every morning she woke up early, dressed neatly, and walked miles handing out applications. Weeks turned into months. Savings slowly disappeared. Then the landlord raised the rent. Maria tried to keep up for as long as she could, but eventually the numbers simply didn't work anymore. The day she packed her belongings into 2 small bags was the day something inside her spirit quietly cracked. Homelessness rarely happens all at once. It happens in small steps that gradually push someone farther away from stability until one day they realize they have nowhere left to go. Daniel listened carefully while Lily sat beside him, unusually quiet. Maria explained how nights had become the hardest part. During the day, there were always places to walk, libraries to sit in, public parks where she could rest without being noticed too much. But night brought cold sidewalks, suspicious looks, and the constant fear of being moved along from wherever she tried to sleep. Some nights she barely slept at all. Some nights she wondered if anyone in the world even noticed she existed. That evening she had walked for hours through the rain before finally sitting beneath the bus stop shelter. She hadn't been waiting for transportation. She had simply run out of strength. Daniel felt a deep ache growing in his chest as he listened. He understood struggle in his own way. Losing Lily's mother had taught him how quickly life could collapse into grief and uncertainty. But hearing Maria's story reminded him that some battles were fought entirely alone, without the support of family or a place to feel safe. Across the table, Lily watched Maria with wide, thoughtful eyes. Children often understand empathy in its purest form. After Maria finished speaking, the room fell into a gentle silence. The soup had long since cooled, and the rain outside had softened into a quiet drizzle tapping lightly against the windows. Daniel finally spoke. He told Maria she was welcome to stay the night, just one night to rest, to be warm, to sleep somewhere safe without worrying about the cold. Maria's eyes filled with tears she clearly hadn't expected. Gratitude can be overwhelming when someone has been ignored for too long. That night, Daniel prepared the small guest room that had remained mostly unused since his wife passed away. Fresh sheets, a soft blanket, a lamp glowing warmly beside the bed. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. When Maria stepped inside the room, she paused in the doorway, as if unsure whether she was truly allowed to enter. For someone who had spent months sleeping on benches and sidewalks, a bed can feel almost unreal. Daniel stood beside his father in the hallway. "See, Daddy?" she whispered softly. "She just needed somewhere safe." Daniel smiled gently, though his thoughts were complicated. Kindness is simple in theory, but often complicated in practice. He knew one night could easily turn into a longer responsibility. He didn't know Maria's full story, her past, or what the future might hold. But when he saw the way Maria carefully sat on the edge of the bed, almost afraid to disturb it, he realized something important. Sometimes helping someone isn't about knowing every answer. Sometimes it's simply about refusing to let another human being face the darkness alone. Over the next few days, something unexpected began to happen. Maria slowly started helping around the house. At first, it was small things, washing dishes, tidying the living room, watering the plants near the window. She moved quietly, almost as if trying not to take up too much space. But Lily noticed everything. Each morning, she greeted Maria with the same bright smile. She asked about her favorite foods, her favorite colors, her favorite childhood memories. Slowly, the tension that had lived in Maria's shoulders began to soften. It had been a long time since someone treated her like a person instead of a problem. Daniel began helping Maria search for work again. He updated her resume, drove her to job interviews, and helped her find clothing suitable for those interviews. Weeks passed, and then one afternoon, Maria came home holding a small envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a job offer from a local bakery. It wasn't a high-paying position, but it was steady work, a starting point, a chance to rebuild. Maria cried that day in the kitchen, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like an empty road. But even as life began slowly improving, none of them realized how deeply their lives had already become connected, because the greatest changes were still ahead. As the weeks turned into months, the house that once felt quiet and heavy with old memories slowly began to fill with something new. It was not just the sound of conversation or the smell of fresh bread Maria sometimes brought home from the bakery after her shift. It was a deeper kind of warmth, the kind that grows when people begin to care for one another in ways they never expected. Maria worked hard at the bakery. Every morning she woke up before sunrise, tying her hair back and walking out the door with a quiet determination that Daniel deeply respected. The job was not easy. Long hours, early mornings, and the physical strain of standing all day would have discouraged many people, but Maria never complained. For her, every shift meant stability, dignity, and the chance to prove to herself that she could rebuild her life piece by piece. Slowly, the exhaustion that once shadowed her face began to fade. Her eyes, which had once carried the distant look of someone who had lost everything, started to brighten again. Lily noticed it first.
Children have an incredible ability to see small changes in the people they love. She began calling Maria Miss Maria at first, but over time the title softened into simply Maria, spoken with the comfort of someone who felt completely safe around her. Daniel noticed something else as well. For the first time since his wife had passed away, their house no longer felt incomplete. The silence that used to sit heavily in the evenings had been replaced with laughter during dinner and stories shared over cups of tea. Maria had a gentle way of listening that made people feel heard, and sometimes Daniel found himself talking about things he had not spoken about since the hardest days of his grief. Maria never tried to replace the past. She simply became part of the present. One evening, months after the rainy night when everything had begun, Daniel sat quietly in the living room watching Lily and Maria working on a school project at the kitchen table. Colored papers, glue sticks, and markers were scattered everywhere as Lily explained her assignment with great enthusiasm. Maria listened patiently, offering ideas and encouragement with the warmth of someone who had grown to care deeply. Daniel realized something powerful in that moment. What had started as a single act of kindness had quietly grown into something much bigger than any of them expected. Maria had found stability again, but Daniel and Lily had also found something they didn't realize they were missing. Family does not always arrive in the ways we expect. Sometimes it begins with a small question asked by a child looking through a rainy window. One afternoon, Maria returned from work holding another envelope, but this time the look on her face carried both excitement and nervousness. Inside the envelope was the approval letter for a small apartment she had applied for weeks earlier. It was modest, just one bedroom, but it meant independence. It meant the next step in rebuilding her life. When she finished explaining, the room grew quiet. This was a moment they had all known would eventually come. Maria's voice trembled slightly as she thanked Daniel for everything he had done. She spoke about the night he had walked through the rain and offered her a bowl of soup when she had almost given up hope. She explained that his kindness had changed the direction of her life in ways she would never forget. But the hardest part for her was saying goodbye. Lily's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. She had grown used to Maria being there every day, helping with homework, baking cookies on weekends, telling stories about her childhood that made even ordinary moments feel special. The thought of the house becoming quiet again felt unbearable. Maria knelt down and hugged Lily tightly. She explained gently that moving into her own apartment didn't mean disappearing. It simply meant she was strong enough to stand on her own again. Daniel watched the moment quietly, feeling a mixture of pride and emotion. Helping someone rebuild their life sometimes means letting them move forward without needing you anymore. But before Maria could finish packing a few belongings, Lily said something that changed everything once again. With tears still shining in her eyes, she asked if Maria could still come for dinner sometimes, maybe on weekends, maybe on holidays, maybe whenever she wanted. Maria smiled through her own tears, and Daniel realized something simple but beautiful. Maria might be moving into her own apartment, but she would never truly be leaving their lives. Because family is not defined by walls or addresses. Family is built through kindness, trust, and the quiet moments when people choose to care for one another. Months later, Maria's small apartment became a place filled with light and laughter. She often baked bread and brought it over to Daniel and Lily's house. Sometimes Lily stayed overnight at Maria's place, treating the tiny apartment like a second home. And every time rain began falling against the windows, Daniel remembered the night everything had changed. One small question, one small act of compassion, one decision to open the door instead of turning away. Before this story ends, there is something important we would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell us what would you have done if you saw someone alone in the rain that night. Your thoughts and experiences matter, and they might inspire someone else watching this story.
And if this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us how powerful compassion truly can be. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness don't just change one life, sometimes they quietly change many. And it all begins with someone brave enough to open the door.